Fearsome warriors, powerful druids, and flashy plaid clothing. That is what most people know about the ancient Celts of Europe. But today you're going to learn something new. That is, what they ate and how you can make a Celtic boar and hazelnut stew. So thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring this video as we dine like a druid, this time on Tasting History. So typically on Tasting History, I have a recipe from history which I recreate. But unfortunately, the ancient Celts of Europe didn't leave us much of a written record, especially when it came to what they ate. Most of what we know about them actually comes from the ancient Greeks and Romans. Then there is the archaeological record, which can either refute or sometimes bolster what those Romans and Greeks were saying. So I used all of those clues, both archaeological and written, to recreate a dish that might have been eaten by the majority of Celtic tribes. And I say the majority because the Celts spanned a very long period of time and were active from Turkey to France and from Spain all the way up to the British Isles. So that said, I took most of my inspiration from dishes and ingredients that would have been available in Gaul or modern-day France pre-Roman conquest. So for this recipe, what you'll need is a half pound or 225 grams of hazelnuts with their skins removed, a half cup or 115 grams of salted butter. Butter was incredibly important in ancient Celtic societies, and it was, as Pliny the Elder said, the one thing that distinguishes the wealthy man from the lower orders. 1 pound or 450 grams of boar. Now ideally this would have been a nice piece of meat from the leg or the thigh of the boar. But unfortunately, there seems to be like a boar meat shortage going on because my boar guys, and I have 2 of them, neither of them could get me actual pieces of boar. All they could get me was ground boar. So it's not going to change the flavor, but it might change the texture a little bit. Though, even if you are using an actual piece of boar, you're going to cut that up as fine as you can. 1 tablespoon of mustard seeds lightly ground, 1 to 2 cups of chopped leek, a half cup of chopped chives, 3 cups of fresh greens chopped small, 3 cups or 480 grams of wheat berries, a small bunch of sorrel, a small bunch of marjoram, and you also need about a tablespoon of salt for seasoning. And the ancient Celts were famous for their salt because as far back as 7,000 years ago, people were mining salt from the Hallstatt salt mine in Austria. And throughout the Celtic period, it was one of the chief sources of salt that they used to trade. Now, aside from salt, another thing that the Celts were famous for were their cauldrons. From everyday cooking cauldrons to fantastic silver cauldrons that are truly works of art and often thought to have magical powers. But if you don't have an enchanted cauldron laying around, then any pot will do, but you do want to make sure it's a nice big pot because this is a 1-pot meal that you're going to start by frying your hazelnuts. I crushed mine up a little bit, but you don't want to ground them up too fine because you want them there for texture. So melt half the butter in the pot over medium heat and then add the nuts and coat them in the butter, letting them toast until you can smell the nuttiness. Then add in the leeks and chives along with the rest of the butter, making sure everything gets well coated. Then let them cook down for about 5 minutes and then add in the boar with the mustard seed. And you're going to want to cook this for another 5 minutes or so, but if you are using bigger pieces of boar, then maybe let it cook for like 10 before adding in all of the greens. Stir the greens into the meat and within a couple minutes they should shrink down, and then you can add about 6 cups or 1.5 liters of water. Let the pot come to a gentle simmer and let it cook for 20 minutes until everything is nice and soft. Give it a taste and add some salt. I used about a tablespoon, but really it's to taste. Finally, mix in all of the wheat berries. Now, depending on what wheat you use, it's going to soak up liquid at different rates and in different amounts. What you're looking for is for the berries to plump up really nice and take up pretty much all of the liquid in the pot. So you might have to add a little bit more water if need be. Either way, it's going to take about 20 to 25 minutes to get there, plenty of time to check out what those ancient Romans and Greeks were saying about their Celtic neighbors. The Gauls are tall, with rippling muscles and white of skin, and their hair is blonde, and not only naturally so, but they also make it their practice by artificial means to increase the distinguishing color which nature has given it. That was the ancient Greek historian Diodorus Siculus, and he wrote extensively about the Celts, especially of Western Europe. And by that description, he seems rather impressed with the people who, at the time that he was writing, were the barbaric foes of the classical world. And I do think that he and the Greek historian and philosopher Posidonius are some of the less biased sources from that time period. So when they talk about the food and the eating habits of the Celts, we can take it a bit more seriously than some other contemporary or later writers. Like, both of them agree that when the Celts sat down to eat, they all sit not upon chairs, but upon the ground, using for cushions the skins of wolves or dogs. They sit in a circle with the most influential man in the center, whether he be the greatest in warlike skill, nobility of family, or most wealthy. Beside him sits the host, and on either side of them the others in order of distinction. They say that the serving is done mostly by the youngest people there, boys and girls, the kids of the people who are eating, and they would bring in the food and set it on low tables this far off the ground. And their food consists of a few loaves of bread and a good deal of meat brought up floating in water and roasted on the coals or on spits. And the reason that the meat is floating in water is that a common way of cooking at the time was to take meat and wrap it in either leaves or very thick grass and then put it into a cauldron filled with water and then add hot stones, like really, really hot stones that would bring the water to a simmer, slow cooking the meat. Then the meat could be taken out and finished off on either the coals or over an open flame. And once cooked, they eat their meat like lions, taking up whole joints in both their hands and gnawing them. And if there is any which they cannot easily tear away, they cut it off with a small sword which they have in a sheath in a special box. And the type of meat that they were eating really depended on where they were in Europe and, of course, the time of year. But it wasn't always game meat, especially in Gaul. Their flocks of sheep and herds of swine were so very large that they supply an abundance of salt meat, not only to Rome, but most parts of Italy. And those who live near the rivers eat fish also, as do those who live near the Mediterranean Sea or near the Atlantic Ocean. And they eat it roasted with salt and vinegar and cumin seed. But providing they weren't eating fish and it was indeed meat, the cut of meat was very important, and to whom it went. See, the cut of meat that was the choicest usually came from the thigh, and contrary to many civilizations then and later, the best cut of meat didn't necessarily go to the most powerful person, but rather the Celts reward brave warriors with the choicest portions of the meat. And should there be a disagreement on who that bravest warrior was, well, that's when the fun really began. For if anyone else laid claim to it, then the two rose up to fight till one of them was slain. And surely it wasn't always a fight to the death, or else they would run out of brave warriors rather quickly. But fighting at these Celtic feasts seems to have been quite a common pastime. It is their custom, even during the course of the meal, to seize upon any trivial matter as an occasion for intense arguments, and then to challenge one another to single combat without any regard for their lives. But fighting aside, the ancient Celts seem to have been really quite good hosts at a feast, inviting strangers to eat with them without even knowing who they were or what they wanted until after the feast. That's when that conversation would happen. And many Greek and Roman writers kind of write about that, thinking that it's kind of weird, but it seems to have been part of the etiquette of the Celts. Be hospitable and welcoming? Yes. Have the occasional fight to the death at the table? Also yes. Now, one of the aspects of table manners, I guess, of the Celts that I find kind of interesting is that in contrast with the Romans, there was really no time when it was acceptable to stuff yourself and really gorge. They looked down on that. And it wasn't because they thought they would look greedy or anything. It was because they didn't want to put on weight. Strabo said they endeavor not to grow fat or pot-bellied, and any young man who exceeds the standard measure of the girdle is punished. The Celts seem to have been really big into body image because both the Romans and the Greeks often lauded them on how clean and presentable they were, talking about the way that they made and used soap, which some have suggested was introduced to the Romans by the Celts. They were also said to take very good care of their clothing, which was often plaid, as well as their hair, which Diodorus mentioned was blonde, but that they would dye it to make it even more blonde. They are always washing their hair in lime water, and they pull it back from the forehead to the top of the head and back to the nape of the neck, with the result that their appearance is like that of satyrs and pans, since the treatment of their hair makes it so heavy and coarse that it differs in no respect from the mane of horses. So just like so many who have dyed their hair blonde once too often, it looked a little dry and fried. But at least they pulled it back to keep it out of the food when they were eating. The same thing could not be said of their facial hair. Some of them shaved the beard, but others let it grow a little. And the nobles shave their cheeks, but let their mustache grow until it covers the mouth. Consequently, when they are eating, their mustaches become entangled in the food. And when they are drinking, the beverage passes, as it were, through a kind of strainer. Though for every ancient historian who talks about how clean and put together they were, there's another historian or 5 who talk about how they were filthy barbarians. So take that for what you will. Now, for all the foods that they did have available to them, there were 2 very important things that they did not have, and 2 things that both the Greeks and the Romans held in very high regard. The Gauls at the time knew no knowledge either of wine made from grapes or of oil such as is produced by our olive trees. Now, exactly what time this is that he's referring to, I'm not sure, because in Gaul, while the olive oil never really took off before the Romans came, over 10,000 amphorae of wine dating from before the Roman conquest have been found. So at some point, possibly as far back as the 7th century BC, wine was making its way into Gaul. But it was very, very expensive and was definitely a drink for the wealthy. But to the horror of many of the Romans and Greeks, they say that the Celts would drink this wine unmixed or undiluted with water, though they would sometimes add cumin to it, which kind of something I actually want to try. And while this wine, cumined or non-cumined, was for the wealthy, at least before the Romans arrived, Diodorus says that those who did drink it were addicted to the stuff and would drink it to the point of passing out or even madness. Consequently, many of the Italian traders, induced by the love of money which characterizes them, believe that the love of wine of these Gauls is their own godsend. For they transport the wine by means of boats and on wagons, and receive for it an incredible price. For in exchange for a jar of wine, they receive a slave, getting a servant in return for the drink. But most people couldn't afford that, so they had to make their own liquors, one of which was mead made from honey. And I think it's really interesting how, I'm pretty sure, referring to mead, Diodorus says they drink the water with which they cleanse their honeycombs. Now, could he just be saying that they drank honey-flavored water? Maybe, but I think that he is talking about mead. But rather than it being a mead that was purposefully created by putting honey and water together and letting it ferment like it would be done later in history, and as I did in my video on mead, this was made simply by washing out honeycombs, and then the water that then had honey in it would ferment and become like accidental mead. I think that's really cool. But much more famous than their mead, the Celts were known for drinking a foul-smelling liquor made from barley rotted in water. That would be beer, and it could be made with all sorts of different grains and flavored with honey or different botanicals, and was drunk mostly by the poorer classes, and the Romans and Greeks alike found it pretty repugnant. But its byproduct was quite useful, according to Pliny the Elder. When the grain of Gaul and Spain is steeped to make beer, the foam that forms on the surface in the process is used for leavening, a consequence of which those races have a lighter kind of bread than others. And throughout the Middle Ages and up to the early 20th century, far more popular in making leavened bread and yeast than using sourdough was to use ale barm, which is the yeast that is left over after making ale or beer. So maybe the Celts were onto something. And when they drank this beer, at least in groups, they did so rather politely. They all drink it out of the same cup in small draughts, not taking more than a sip at a time. But they take frequent draughts. So perhaps I should take some small but frequent draughts of beer as I eat this boar and hazelnut stew, which should be about ready. And here we are, a boar and hazelnut stew as enjoyed by the ancient Celts of Europe. Here we go. That is hearty. Eating this is going to give your mandible a workout. It is hearty. That, you know, just, there's so much in there and it's so compact because we let the water kind of soak into everything that the texture is just hearty. But not in a bad way. I mean, it's nice, it's filling. I think that a very small amount will go a very long way. What is nice is that, so the meat and the wheat and the greens, they've all really softened, but the hazelnuts have kept a little bit of that crunch, which is nice when you get one of those. So that's why I wouldn't break them up too small, because you want that texture in there. Otherwise, it kind of has the texture of like oatmeal or something like that. As far as flavor goes, it definitely, you could play with all the different ingredients to kind of make certain flavors jump out. For me, I'm getting a lot of the herbs, the sorrel and the marjoram, and that's what I wanted personally. So even though it's really hearty, you get this kind of light herbaceous flavor, and then you get the hazelnuts and everything else is in there as well, but that's kind of the dominant flavor when you first bite into it. So that's the cool thing about a recipe like this, is that you can tweak all of the ingredients to make it your own and make certain flavors more dominant than others, and you can make it a little bit differently each time that you prepare the dish. Now, for my version, I'm going to be putting that recipe up on my forthcoming website that I'm making with help from Squarespace, our sponsor today. Building a website with Squarespace is so easy, especially with their new Fluid engine, a next-generation design system that allows you to customize every detail. It's all drag and drop, which, if you don't know a lot about creating a website, it is a must. It really makes it so easy to make it look like the way that you want it to look. It's perfect whether you're building a personal website or one for your business. And Squarespace has so many tools to make business easier. Making sales through Squarespace is a seamless process for customers, and they make it easy to manage orders, track inventory and sales, and most every other aspect of bookkeeping. And their blogging and email campaign tools make it easier than ever to connect with customers and keep them up to date on new products. So go to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you are ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/tastinghistory to get 10% off of your first purchase of a website or domain. And I will see you next time on Tasting History.